Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to Riggs Library for a very special event with a distinguished scholar, prolific author, one of the great leaders in higher education, Cathy Davidson. And I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Davidson for joining us today to discuss her latest book, The New Education: How to Revolutionize the University to Prepare Students for a World in Flux. I also wish to thank our provost, Bob Groves, who will join Dr. Davidson in conversation this afternoon. Come on in, everybody. Make yourselves at home. As we all know, this is an extraordinary moment in higher education, one that calls all of us to consider how we'll creatively respond to the challenges and opportunities of our day. How will we engage with the demands of our increasingly knowledge-based global society? How will we respond to issues of accessibility and inequality, the rapid evolution of technology, the increased connectivity of our globe? Institutions of higher learning are uniquely impacted by these issues and have a unique role to play in addressing these challenges. The New Education provides important context for understanding how universities have changed or not changed in response to this historical moment. Dr. Davidson uncovers the ways in which today's community colleges, large public institutions, private colleges alike are fueling learning with new approaches and tools through creativity, innovative use of technology, interdisciplinary collaboration, and alternatives to traditional testing and evaluation. For our institution here at Georgetown, with our identity as a Catholic and Jesuit university, these issues have particular resonance. The tradition of Jesuit education calls us to approach both challenges and opportunities with, in the words of Father Adolfo Nicolas, a depth of thought and imagination. In his landmark 2010 address, which he delivered in Mexico City at a gathering of Jesuit college and university leaders from around the world, he reminded us, and I quote, "Creativity might be one of the most important things in present times, real creativity, not merely following slogans or repeating what we have heard or what we have seen in Wikipedia. Real creativity is an active, dynamic process of finding responses to real questions, finding alternatives to an unhappy world that seems to go in directions that nobody can control." Close quote. In 2013, under the leadership of our Vice Provost Randy Bass, we launched our Designing the Futures of the University initiative, which aims to reimagine the work of the university and engage in those words of Father Nicolas, an active, dynamic process of finding responses to real questions. Some of these innovations emerging from our initiative, again under Randy and Bob's leadership, are documented in a chapter of The New Education. The questions explored by the initiative and within Dr. Davidson's work are urgent. And how will our universities of higher learning respond to this rapidly changing world? How can we draw on our creativity and imagination in order to do so? I'm so pleased that we have a chance to welcome Cathy Davidson back to our campus to engage with her book and her work on this topic. She currently serves as Distinguished Professor of English at the City University of New York, where she is also co-director of the CUNY Humanities Alliance, a program that prepares graduate students to teach in community colleges. There she is the co-director of the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Alliance and Collaboratory, which she co-founded in 2002, and is founding director of the Futures Initiative. And prior to these roles, she also taught at Duke University for more than 2 decades, where she also held the role of Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Studies. We were commenting just earlier, we had a chance to spend a little bit of time together before we came upstairs for this conversation. I asked, what year did you do that Coursera course on the idea of the university? and I'm afraid to say it was a few years longer than I thought it was, but I was a regular in that course, and I feel like I've known her forever, because if you've taken one of those courses, you know you get to know the teacher very, very well. So it's an honor for me to welcome back to campus Cathy Davidson in conversation with our provost, Bob Groves, and thank you all for being here.
And needless to say, President DeGioia was the very best of the 18,000 students in that class.
I heard he was disruptive in class. So Cathy, you don't know this, but you have drawn a set of people from the entire university here. This is an enormously diverse crowd, and it's just a tribute to you. Welcome back to the Hilltop.
Great to be here.
Thank you for coming by on your global book tour, that you would grace us with your presence. And what we'll do is we'll have a little conversation here, and then at a certain point we will stop that conversation. Someone's going to, oh my goodness, Randy is in charge of the timing. We may be late. And then Cathy has an interactive in-class exercise that is related to these little cards that are sitting on your chairs, and then we'll have a little Q&A. And then we'll do a little book signing, I think. So that's kind of the way forward. And we'll begin with just a little question and answer among the two of us. So you say in this wonderful book that you've written, quote, "The traditional infrastructure of the contemporary university remains remarkably similar to what Charles Eliot and his colleagues designed decades ago. Yet it is no longer serving our students well." This is an important 2 sentences of the book. So why do you say that?
So the usual cliche about higher education is it can't change because it hasn't changed in 2,000 years since Socrates walked the floor of the academy. I've seen that sentence endless times. But in fact, in the 19th century, higher education went through this huge change to deal with the industrial world. And in the United States, Charles Eliot was the leader of the change, along with many, many others at that time period. But most people aren't aware of how many things that are the features, the basic features, the DNA of our university, were really not very prevalent in American higher education before 1860, and were fully in place by 1920. I don't have the whole list, but it goes something like majors, minors, general education, the silos that divide humanities from social science from sciences. Still the general education course was carried over from the Puritan College, credit hours, grades, IQ tests, multiple choice entrance exams, tenure, sabbaticals, salaries that paid a living wage. Charles Eliot's father lost everything in the Panic of 1857, and Eliot had to give up college teaching at Harvard. He was a Harvard graduate because it was assumed you had an independent income. Harvard didn't pay well enough to teach at Harvard. I mean, to be able to teach at Harvard and live off your salary. All of those things. Not only did all those things change, they also, graduate school, law school, professional medical school, the first freestanding college-associated business schools, nursing schools, all of that apparatus which was designed to train, to create, define, credential a new professional managerial class for all of these new occupations that hadn't existed before. Basically global capitalism, the beginning of global corporate capitalism, and all of the different offices within that. And at the same time, credentialing bodies to credential the credentialing of individuals. So the American Medical Association gets incorporated. The American Bar Association is founded. The Modern Language Association, the American Historical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Sociological Association, all of the different accrediting boards, the equivalent of ETS, the educational testing. All of this is created at this time period. SATs were fully established by 1925. So what do we do? I mean, that was important to make all of those changes for a new world that needed to understand what professions were and credential them. our world changed on, I love it that there's a day. April 22nd, 1993. That's the day the scientists from the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, the University of Illinois, came out. Larry Smarr was the person who made the announcement, who said, we have this thing called the Mosaic 1.0 browser. And with it, any single person with an internet connection can be connected to anybody else in the world with an internet connection. For the first time in history, if I have an idea, I can communicate that to anyone else who has an internet connection without an editor and without a publisher. Right? It's a really different world than the world of top-down credentialing, deciding what's true, deciding what counts, deciding what a profession is, deciding what a field is, what counts as a field. Now we're in a world where I'm not even sure fields count anymore. Right? I think the questions that this generation of students are dealing with are so complicated and so vast and so intermingled that those old divisions between the humanities, the social sciences, the sciences, divisions between disciplines, the regulation of what a discipline is, really don't matter. I don't know how many of the medical students here at Georgetown also pursue other degrees. And when I was at Duke, you had to take 1 year off from medical school to get a degree in something else. Usually it was a master's degree. Why? Because medical school didn't begin to comprehend all the things you needed to do every day as a competent doctor. You might take a class you might take a degree in computer science, or in business, or in engineering. Right? These are different worlds, and the fields that we've inherited don't begin to comprehend the complexity of the questions we all have to answer right now.
So, but during that time, and since that time, new fields have emerged. And what can we learn from that emergence that might apply to what appears to be a radically different rate of change? Right. How do you
So I think what we learned from that emergence, and this is, I'm often accused of being a perennial optimist, and it is my nature to be optimistic. And what we learn from that is fields can grow up in the most static institutions. Fields often grow up around the periphery that are exciting and vibrant. I don't think there's a university or college in the country where something really exciting isn't happening. And that gives me hope, that in other words, there are people who don't want to be constrained, no matter how rigid the structure of a credentialing is and accreditation and all the different structures that universities have to be responsible to. There are always people who say, I want something else. And there are administrations that are willing to expand and allow those exciting things to happen. As President DeGioia said, one of my case studies in the book is the Red House here at Georgetown, because I just was so fascinated by this interesting institution that within an institution was also pushing innovation in lots of different, pushing and welcoming, both pushing and pulling innovation in all kinds of directions. To me, that means that even in the most constricted environment, we are ultimately interested in higher education. And if we're all in this room because we're passionate about higher education, we will find ways to make it work. It would be nice if the structures we've inherited were flexible enough to make that work as a support rather than something we have to work around. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I've done this. It's a mean thing to do, where when I'm talking to all faculty, I sometimes say to people, how many people find that their closest friends at the university are not their colleagues in the department? How many people dread going to department meetings but love going to the meetings of their center or their institute? It's not always the case, but it's often the case that people's most exciting intellectual work is not happening in the department that's their home. And that's often the case for students too, right? You're clicking off the things, checking off the things to get your major, but your real excitement is this research project or this service learning project, or an independent study you're pursuing, or something you fell into by accident. I interviewed a wonderful young student from Harvard who had graduated from Harvard. And I said, and who was in a self-design major at Harvard. And I said, was there anything you didn't like about it? He said, yeah, there were so many things I wanted to learn, but all of our classes have to be graded. And I want to go on to get a PhD, JD degree, and I know I have to have an A average. So I didn't dare take advantage of the riches that were all around me. He said, I wanted to. I knew I would be a C student if I took a Python class, but, you know, with computer science majors. But I would have been willing to do it. But I knew it would cripple my whole career, so I couldn't. That makes me a little heartbroken. Right? So those are the kinds of things that are both positive and negative. But it gives me hope that we can change, because we do all the time.
Actually, my next question fits into this comment about technology. So you write in the book about sort of the unbridled passion for technology and the limitless fear of technology. And all of us have lived through a very interesting time in the building of MOOCs, the hype phase of MOOCs. And now I think a more sober, more sophisticated view of what worked and what didn't. So looking towards the future, what do you see as the role of technology in pedagogy going forward in higher education?
Okay. Yes, there's a chapter called Against Technophobia, and then the next chapter is Against Technophilia, because I think both of those extremes do the same thing. They invest way too much power in technology and not in us as humans, for whom supposedly that technology is made. Although we'll talk about the ethics of the current technological moment, I'm sure, in this conversation as well. MOOCs, anybody who knew anything about learning or about technology knew that MOOCs were not going to do all the things that people said they were going to do. MOOCs are massive online open courseware, and I taught one of the very first ones. At first, they were having star professors teach in certain areas, and they asked me to teach the one on the history and future of higher education, where President DeGioia was a superb student to 18,000 students. And what I did was, Thomas Friedman in the New York Times said, not only would this cut tuitions in half at our universities, but it would end global poverty. I mean, really. You know, that is not going to happen. And it didn't happen. To their credit, and this is a backwards way of answering the question, but I think it's an important one. I said I didn't believe in the learning model of one person lecturing to students. That's great, and we all learn from that, but that's not really what interactive learning is. And I asked if I could do something different in my MOOC, and that's have 14 on-site students who came from Duke, University of North Carolina State, undergraduates and graduate students, an Iraqi veteran who was dealing with terrible brain damage and was taking the class while he was going through physical therapy and cognitive therapy, 2 undergraduates, PhD students, computer scientists. You know, so we had many people applied for the class, and I chose 14 to be as different as possible. And then they tried to turn the 18,000 students around the world into a gigantic seminar. It was an amazing experience, right? There was somebody in Ecuador who, on his own, every time I would do one of my canned lectures, and then it would turn into a seminar that the students would conduct online, he would do mind maps on his own of all the conversations that were happening around the world. These were beautiful, and he just did them because he was interested. It was quite astonishing. We had a group in New Zealand, they met in McDonald's where the bandwidth was good enough. They would watch the lecture, then they would take part in the seminar my students would conduct. And they would, you know, the biggest problem in the class was my on-site students were totally insomniac for 6 weeks because they were all keeping office hours. Instead of a midterm exam, they had to keep office hours. But we tried to do it for the global 24/7 calendar. But Thailand would just be going to bed when China would wake up, and they would stay awake, and they'd come into class totally exhausted because they'd be up all night and having these amazing conversations with people all over the world. I think some version of that is more likely going to be transformative in the next phase, where there's some version where you say the real affordance of technology now is the human affordance of having global context in a very, very personal way. I end the chapter on MOOCs with something that totally shocked me. Somebody in Thailand took a picture of his screen with the seminar my students were conducting based on my lectures, up on the screen. One of his hands is on the keyboard. The other one's taking a picture with the cell phone. So it's his hand, the screen, and behind him the streets of Bangkok. And he said, I just want you to know, I am here, you are there, but we're together. All over the world, students start taking the same picture and posting it to the website. I am here, you are there, we're together. That to me is a pretty amazing model of what you can do for technology, with technology that assists something very passionate and human and important about learning, which is learning is always social, learning is always interactive, and learning is always going from a place. We often think of universities like Georgetown, which has such a superb student body, as being about your achievement when you come in. If there's anything I've learned, especially from teaching at a community college and working with community colleges now, is learning really should be about what you don't know and getting to that place of unknowing so you can build on that. And it takes a lot of confidence to admit I don't have a clue and I still want to learn. And I think these global communities that we were seeing in this MOOC, and there are many variations of it, were partly about everybody learning something together firsthand, but also in a system where people could question each other, follow up. We had a number of online hackathons where students would contribute. One was, let's do a worldwide timeline of higher education from the beginning to the present. Well, the University of Bologna is not the first university in the world. Suddenly we're finding out about universities that go back to 1000 BC in ancient India, and places all over the world are talking about the universities and the foundations of universities that are not Western universities. And then somebody had us going way up to the interplanetary stratosphere in the future. But these are different kinds of knowledge that people are contributing that added to our knowledge, which often was at nothing. We thought we were smart, and we realized there were whole worlds of knowledge we weren't privy to before. And that kind of exposure was really key.
But looking forward and thinking of sort of the sector, what's your vision of the role of technology on a campus like this and others?
So one, we deserve a lot better technology than we've been given. I think a lot of the ed tech at our universities that we invested in, and often that we contributed to. I mean, there was a time when Blackboard was something everyone was contributing to, and then suddenly it was being sold for millions and millions of dollars with, okay, wait, didn't I contribute to that? I thought we were a community. It turns out we're a corporation, and I don't own it, right? So there's lots of ed tech that I think is not as good as it should be. It's much better at surveillance, for example, than collaboration, right? I would say most ed tech that I'm familiar with is superb at surveillance and pretty terrible at collaboration, right? Often has very sketchy privacy and security rules. I sometimes get very worried about the kinds of things. I believe in e-portfolios. I believe in online communities. I started one in 2002. NSF says we're the world's first and oldest academic social network. Haystack existed before MySpace, which probably most of you don't even remember. That was before Facebook, right? So that's a long time ago in tech world. But I'm very worried about how universities can often sign over service agreements that allow, I don't know what Georgetown says. I'm not speaking in code here. I literally don't know what things are here at Georgetown. But at many universities I've traveled to and been aware of, they're using educational technologies that can be mined for data that then comes back to students in the form of advertising or other kinds of micro-algorithmically derived target marketing. I think we have to be more cautious about that as a society. Forget just education, all society. I think that we need far better tools for true collaboration and much more sophisticated tools for collaboration at our universities. And I think that's going to happen. But I also think we need so I believe we need not just digital literacy, but we need the equivalent of defensive driving for the digital age. My original field was the last information age. What happened to literacy when mass printing made books and magazines available to working and middle-class readers for the first time in human history. It's about the time of the American Revolution. In fact, the same person who published the preamble to the Constitution in the same month published the preamble to the first American novel, which attacked the Constitution. It said, what about all the people that got left out of the Constitution? It's common in the history of technology for there to be rampant innovation, and then somebody writes a book, the equivalent of The Jungle, for the last information age, where people are like, wait, meatpacking industries, what about health standards? What about labor practices? What about safeguarding citizens? I think we're at the point where we desperately need a jungle for the internet age, that we've had a whole generation of rampant technological development, fabulous, exciting technological development, but almost no, you can't sue the maker of an algorithm. Right? We have algorithms now that know more about us than we know about us, right? I mean, we know that. I mean, I used to teach with a behavioral economist, Dan Ariely, and we'd go into a room and he said, I'm going to ask a question. I bet 85% of the students are going to give this answer. And 85% of the students would give that answer. You know, he knows that from lots of research in that area, how easily we're tricked by our own prejudices. Algorithms on Facebook and social media are designed to trick us about our own prejudices. I think it's time that we understood more about how we're being coerced so we could fight back a little bit. We also need different labor laws, better labor laws. We need better environmental laws. I recently read, and I checked it out, and I don't quite understand this. You know, Bitcoin, every transaction of Bitcoin is embedded in every transaction of Bitcoin. So according to an article that was in The Economist a week or two ago, one Bitcoin transaction uses the same amount of energy as an average house uses in a month. That's kind of crazy, right? So there's lots of things that are modern technology that we have to learn about so that we can have the equivalent of what happened at the end of the 19th century and at the great age of industrialization, where consumers said, we need to know a little bit more about this industrialization and put in some fairer practices. We need those now, I think, for this post-industrial technological age too, including replication of workers with algorithms, outsourcing of jobs with algorithms, contingent labor, all of the things that have been happening in the modern economy, micro-trading, rapid micro-trading. You know, every aspect of life has changed. And we have to have now an education that catches up with that enough to say, let's make some rules here. Let's make some regulations here. It's been a pretty unregulated industry for a generation now.
Let me ask a question about you. So you spent years at Duke, and now you're at the City University of New York. These are fantastically different institutions.
Fantastically different.
Give us a little insight into sort of your motivation for those moves and what you've learned by the two environments.
Thanks. So I guess I shouldn't say this to Hoyas, but I loved teaching at Duke. They really aren't so bad, guys. I know we're rivals, but I became very upset about public education. Over 80% of Americans are educated at public educations, at public institutions. You cannot have a modern, responsible society without modern, responsible public education. And it's just the things that are happening in public education around this country right now are tragic. I mean, really tragic. The gutting of great public institutions, state after state, horrible. But when I would talk about that, and it said, you know, John Hope Franklin, Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies, and Ruth F. DeVarney, Professor of English, Duke University, to an audience, I'd get this look like, how dare you? How dare you? Distinguished professor at Duke University talk about public education. So a few years ago, I was up for a presidency at a big public university, and I called my friend Bill Kelly, who was head of the Graduate Center at CUNY, and I said, can I talk to you about whether I really want to take on a presidency of a public university? Can I really be an educational reformer and fight a legislature 24/7? Because it would have been a state where I would have been doing that. And he convinced me that I couldn't, that there was no way to do both, that being a university president, probably President DeGioia could confirm this. Being a president of a university is a full-time job. You can't also be an advocate for educational change nationally at all institutions and run a major university. But he said, why don't you come to CUNY, the poorest per capita university, the biggest urban university, the most diverse university. About half of our students in the entire CUNY system live below the poverty line. At some of the colleges that I now have programs at 17 of the 24 CUNY colleges. And at some of those, as close to 80% of the students have family incomes in New York City of to less than $25,000 a year. So I did. I thought it would be great to come to CUNY and try something different. And all those people who said I was a jerk talking about public education when I was from the position of Georgetown were 100%, I mean, from the position of Duke, were 100% right. I don't think it's possible to know what everyday life is like at a really stressed university until you've actually been part of it. I teach graduate students who teach undergraduates. A fellowship in a graduate school at CUNY means for your fellowship, you're teaching an independent course at one of the CUNY campuses. And so I teach graduate students who are teaching undergraduates, and then I also teach some undergraduates. But one of my graduate students said, I've got this brilliant student who's an A+ student in class, but whenever she writes a paper at home, she's like a B student. And so I asked her, why is that? And she said, well, we don't have bandwidth at home, so I write my papers on my cell phone, and I write them at work. And they'll let me write as we're going to pick a person up in the ambulance. But once we have some, and it turns out she was writing her phone, she's an EMT, works full-time as an EMT while going to school, and she was writing her papers on her cell phone in the ambulance. No wonder she's a B student, right? And no wonder it's going to take her 6 years to graduate. She has a full-time job. She has a family. She doesn't even have bandwidth. I mean, I feel like I've taught some of the smartest, most educationally gifted and educationally prepared students in the world. I think most of us would be tremendously challenged if we were having to write our senior theses on a cell phone while we were going to pick somebody up in an ambulance. You know, it's just, it's a different world. It's also very inspiring because the students I'm working with now are clawing their way, fighting their way. Many of them are DACA students. They're in a tremendously challenged situation. Students of color, first-generation students, fighting for education. If any of you feel cynical about higher education, come hang out with me for a day and you will stop being cynical. These are people who are fighting with their lives for higher education and believe in it. It's the thing they believe will make them, allow them to have a decent life. Not just more money. They want a better life, something they'll feel proud of, their families will feel proud of, their countries of origin will feel proud of. I bet most of the people in this room feel the same way about their education. But there's a kind of urgency that I couldn't have understood from my old position. And I feel humble, absolutely humbled every day by what I see.
That's beautiful. Let me do one more question because it tails on to that one. So this is an institution, as you know full well, that thinks of itself as devoted to social justice in many ways. So just reflecting on us and what we can do with regard to social mobility and the things we care about, despite the fact that we are not touching as many proportionally of those students that you're talking about.
Well, one of the reasons I ended my book with really the afterword of the book is focused on Georgetown, the Red House at Georgetown, and Asseshi University, a new university that just opened in Africa. And one of the reasons is I was so moved by a famous university with a long, long distinguished tradition, but that took social mobility and social justice as seriously as what we call excellence, academic excellence. I would say that in my new life, I now realize the range of excellences is so much greater than we often think of at the most elite institutions. Interestingly, Charles Eliot also invented financial aid because he didn't want to have just the children of Harvard being educated by just the children of Harvard, being educated by, et cetera, et cetera. He wanted a different mix because he knew that was a better education. I think the thing for a university like Georgetown is not only social justice and trying to contribute to a better society, creating leaders who are responsive to a better society in whatever field you go into, remembering that you are privileged. And I think Georgetown does a better job than many, many, many institutions on its level of remembering that we are very lucky to have these kinds of privileges. And it's not that we have somehow intrinsically earned them. We were all given something that allowed us to be at this place. Whether you were lucky enough to be born with affluent parents, or parents who believed in education and fought for you, or a teacher who inspired you, every one of us who has this life had something in their life that was luckier than the majority of Americans, right? It's only about, I can't remember now, what is it, the Ivies Plus. It's what percentage of students in America. It's about 21 million students in America, and I think it's only about less than 1%, less than 1% that are at the equivalent of Georgetown. So I think Georgetown does a better job than most of its peers in its DNA saying we're also something more than an educationally great university. We also believe that there has to be some social moral component that's part of giving back. I also think that I've heard about a new campaign, a new capital campaign at Georgetown, and one of the aims of it is to have even greater social mobility and more students from different backgrounds at Georgetown. Every study of educational excellence says that that is not only great for society and the students who are admitted, but for everybody who's here. It's not just noblesse oblige. You learn in a different way when you learn from unequal institutions and unlike institutions. The organization that I co-founded, Haystack, has a motto that we call collaboration by difference, and that it's basically based on the internet motto, the old internet idea that the more eyeballs you have looking at a problem, and the different kinds of eyeballs in software language of looking at a problem, the less likely you are going to have bugs in the system. I think that's true for education too. The more diverse the people who are contributing in all ways of diversity, the more likely to have something that's a better solution for everybody at the end.
Thank you.
Now everyone gets to be a student.
Now you're making us work. So tell us what to do here.
So everybody should have an index card and a pencil. Think of it as the internet. I love to teach interactivity with something, with these technologies, machine-made paper and a machine-made pencil, to remind people that interactivity is not about technology. You can be just as passive with fancy technology as with no technology, and that interactivity and becoming a responsible citizen of the world we're in is also being able to hear everybody. There's a series of methods, it's often called active learning or inventory methods. And you use these methods to make sure that in any group situation, these were used back in the old freedom schools. Maria Montessori did this back in 1906. It was used at Occupy. I myself have done inventory methods with 6,000 IB teachers in the Philadelphia 76ers auditorium. I also did this for the CIOs and CEOs of the top 100 companies that were part of the Cisco conglomerate. Because CIOs also tend in a group to just go with the most powerful person in the room. And what you want in inventory methods is for everyone to have a chance to hear and think for themselves and then hear somebody else. So I tend to do inventory methods in a quite precise way. We also have educational sociologists who tell us that unless called upon, 20% of students, I said that wrong, 20% of students say that they graduated from college never once speaking in a class except when they were specifically called upon. That to me is a horrible failing, horrible failing. So I try to make one of these experiments every class period where everybody gets to speak. So what we're going to do now is super low stakes. It has to be low stakes. It doesn't work otherwise. Super fast. 90 seconds. I'm going to time for 90 seconds. Just on your card, if you were the king of Georgetown, not just a president who has faculty to deal with, but the king, and you could do 3 things instantly tomorrow to change Georgetown and make it a more relevant, better, a better university, however you define it, what 3 things would you do first? 90 seconds, just 3 quick things. This is part 1.
And Jack has agreed to do the top 5 in the next 2 weeks.
We could collect these. It would be really interesting to see. So part 2, by the way, if your hands are warm, your pencil's changing. This is one of my students from LaGuardia who designed all the swag, including these heat-sensitive pencils that change colors in your hand. If your hands are really warm, they turn bright yellow, all yellow. They're supposed to be symbolic of a world in flux.
If your pencil has not changed color, we have physicians outside who will.
So in part 2 in an inventory exercise, you find a partner, one person, and then I do this in a really religious, strict way. One person, just read the 3 things on your card. Don't elaborate. Just read the 3 things, and the other person listen. Then switch, and let the other person read their 3 things and listen. And then together, take one item. You'll have to collaborate. That's part of the exercise. One thing you want to put together as the one most important thing that together you think you want to, it might take compromise, it might take concession, it might take combining. One thing that you think is the single most important thing we can do to change Georgetown if you were king. So first, one person speaks, the other person listens, vice versa, and then together in your pair come up with one thing. And in the Q&A, I might have you read some of those things out loud. So try that. Find a partner.
So how are we doing?
So that's 90 minutes. That's 90 seconds.
Okay.
It's okay if it's okay. Actually, it's part of the experiment. You don't have. Can I have your attention, please? Can I have your attention, please? 90 seconds. Okay. How many people in the room are teachers, are professors? Anytime you have to fight to get your students' attention back and they're talking about a subject, you have won, right? So that's lesson 1 of inventory learning. I've never, ever done this where I haven't had to call people's attention back. No one gets bored. It's phenomenal for your students. I have a friend who teaches at McGill University, 600 students. He does a version of this with 600 students. What he's found is students read, they plagiarize less, they feel like they're being heard in the classroom. One thing he does, and I often do this, is they write exit tickets, where at the end of every class, he asks his students a question. My favorite that everything I do, I steal from other people. Unfortunately, the world has lots of smart people in it. The exit question he likes to ask is, what thing did we talk about today that's going to keep you awake at night? And if we didn't talk about anything that's going to keep you awake at night, put on the card what we should have been talking about today that'll keep you awake at night. He then has people sign those. He collects them. They count as attendance. They count as a pop quiz. And he's got a great jumping off point for his next lecture. And he says he does a whole theatrical thing where he spreads out all the cards and he does his lecture saying, and then John said, and then Bill said. So in this huge class of 600 people, suddenly people have a voice. Right? These are great methods. I did a blog today on Haystack called the Active Learning Kit. If you just Google my name and Active Learning Kit, it's a blog that puts together several blogs about active learning with research, with a bibliography, with several different kinds of methods and the rationales and research behind those. So you can find that it's instant. And a friend of mine said, well, this is good for, if you're teaching climate change, but how could you do Heidegger? Actually, Heidegger wrote a book on active learning. So there's another blog in there on how you teach Heidegger using active learning. I think now, though, so if this were a class, if it were a small class, I would have each pair go around and read together the thing they came up with together. Because it teaches listening. It teaches contribution without it being a high-stakes test. It also teaches collaboration, how you can make something work together. And I always have people change so that they're working with a different partner every class. Because that's sad to me. We also have educational sociologists who have documented this. People sit in the same class with 20 students and leave without knowing anyone's name. I have students make table tents with their names for every class and always work together, but with different people. It's a great skill. So the other thing is we know from, I always call it haunted by the 8%. This goes all the way back to Dewey. We know if you didn't take a class versus if you did take a class, but it's not a high-stakes test, and you're tested on the content, 6 months later, you've got about 8% advantage over somebody who never took the class, right? We don't learn very much. We don't retain much content except in a test situation. But we do learn techniques for learning. So this kind of thing is one of the active techniques for learning. And these are things that you do take with you in other situations. How do you compromise? How do you listen? How do you hear? How do you come up with ideas in a low-stakes situation? Also, if you're a quiet person, a shy person, there's some magic that happens with reading something you've written versus having to think it and speak it out loud. It's wonderful for people with different cognitive differences. Also wonderful for people of color, for women, people who don't usually ask the first question. But now we are going to go into a Q&A. And if any of you want to read, instead of a regular Q&A, want to read what you wrote on your card or turn that into a question, that would be fantastic. Since it's a different kind of audience here, we won't do the normal read everything that's on your card. If I were in a big class, you have a Google Doc where people wrote their ideas on it, or I might collect the cards. Many different ways. But for here, we'll just do a Q&A about anything we talked about today. But feel free to read what's on your card or to make your question based on what you came up with together as a pair. So questions. I think we have about 10 minutes. 10 minutes for questions. Yes.
Questions and thank you. I teach here, and first I would like to thank you for coming here, and also for people at our university to organize this kind of conversation, because this, for someone who teaches here, it's a signal that I know that this is happening at our university, but it is very important that you are here.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
And the second thing is we actually talked to students, and it looks like what you are calling for, because you just told us, well, you are a king. You are giving us voice. This calls for some kind of radical change of higher education. This calls for more hierarchical approach. And
maybe.
And this, I would still call this radical education. Because you are giving voice to those who would like to speak.
Yes, thank you.
Then how do you see the future of institutions of higher education if we are trying to change the structure of it? If, as we have today, the teachers, professors are standing in front of our students, and the students, they just recite quite often, instead of taking an active role in creating our classroom. So that would be the first one. And also, you compare Duke to CUNY. Well, one of those schools was on the Paradise Papers.
One of those schools was on the...
using endowment.
Ah, yes, yes, yes.
So
yes.
This also is a very important, and it could be a problem. We are not on, Georgetown is not included on that list. But that is, for me, it's also something that should be discussed among our students.
Totally.
Thank you.
People have said, Malcolm Gladwell actually said recently that he would not give money to his two alma maters because basically they're hedge funds with the university attached. You know, so that's a very serious structural issue that I think has to be dealt with by every university very, very seriously right now. How we invest, you know, if Harvard were a country, I believe it would be the 18th largest country in the world in terms of GDP. That may have changed. I think that last time I read that was the number. In terms of what we can do, I think one reason I like to start with pedagogy is because it's very easy to feel paralyzed and say everything has to change and I'm powerless. If you're a professor of pedagogy, you can change tomorrow. That person who hired me at CUNY was the president, had been acting chancellor of the whole CUNY system when he retired. He's now Mellon director of the New York Public Library, but in the year that he had retired, I said, how would you like to co-teach with me the most radical class anyone's ever taught? He's like, what? Sure, sure. So here we walk into a class. There was a lot of fanfare about me being hired. Here's this beloved former president. We walked and we said, hi, we want this class to change your lives. Goodbye. We'll be back in 45 minutes. You come up with a class that'll change your lives. And the only thing we had prepared, and I think this is crucial, was Post-it notes around the room that had every date and all the vacations planned, and said, we just said, divide yourself into units of 4. Come up with the topics. Come up with a reading list. You can develop these in the course of the terms. Come up with an assessment system. And plan the course. But because no one wants to have to deal with, you know, so we did the infrastructure. And we came back in 45 minutes, and the students were like, go away. No, 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 go away. And Bill said, oh, my gosh. I'm like, it's going to work. It's going to work. And we came back like 5 minutes later, and the students were kind of, you know. It was an amazing class. It was an amazing class. And since our 15 graduate students were all teaching up to 70 undergraduates out at the CUNY campuses, what they came up with was a structure where they would come up with an educational experiment every class that then they would do in their undergraduate classes. We would invent, and we did this a very inexpensive, free for the students, WordPress low bandwidth tool that students could use on their phones. So the undergraduates could give us feedback on that pedagogy. We ended up having about 400 undergraduates from the 24 campuses, actually 15 campuses that the students were representing, that would give us feedback on, did this method work for my learning? It's incredible. But anyone can do that. Even these simple little cards with pencils methods. Anyone can do that, and it will change your classroom. But it also changes your students' ideas of themselves. It means for the students, you are an actor. You have agency. You are an actor not just in this classroom, but in the world. If you're graduating from Georgetown, you should be able to believe you can be an actor in the world. Not as somebody who tyrannizes other people, but who can collaborate and understand and hear other people. The much, much, much neglected skill. We're very good at hearing our professors. Very poor at hearing one another. So, you know, from the endowment onto your classroom, start with pedagogy. It gives you muscles for change. Yes?
Thank you. I'm a second-year MSFS student here at Georgetown, and coming from...
I'm afraid we can't hear you. Can you...
Okay. I'm a second-year MSFS student with a background in higher ed as a professional. How do you talked about the diversity of CUNY system. how do you propose a place like Georgetown does that better, so that when you are listening and you're not just listening to the professor and you're listening to your cohort and your colleagues, that you have different voices, more different voices at the table?
So I don't know enough about Georgetown's admissions to know how that happens. How that happens in terms of demographics and changing the numbers. What I do know is one reason that these inventory methods are important is because higher education is often accused of being liberal and progressive, but there are fewer women and fewer people of color in the professorate now than there were 20 years ago in 1997. And if you look at the demographics from presidents on to assistant professors or instructors, and the demographics of Fortune 100 companies from CEOs down to the general workforce, it's almost impossible to tell the difference demographically. So if we say we're progressive and we've had a generation of really important theoretical and critical and scholarly work on race and gender and equity, but it hasn't changed our demographics, then we're doing something wrong. So one of the reasons I use radical pedagogy methods, these are often called active learning or radical pedagogy, where you take an inventory of the whole room, is so that everybody has a chance to speak, not just the people that most replicate me in terms of who I am, what my educational background is, et cetera, and learn to give a different kind of voice. There are many, many other things too, but that's something I can do tomorrow in my classroom, so it's the place I start. But there are many, many other places where those interventions, I think, are absolutely crucial, or else we're hypocrites, right? We're saying one thing and we're replicating ourselves in a way that is not fair. With a doctoral student, Danica Savanek, I've been doing a blog that we update about every 6 months of all the quantitative, typically double-blind studies on gender bias in academia. And there's studies the focus is gender bias in academia. We also have some of the studies on racial bias in academia. It's pretty depressing to see how much quantitative, seemingly objective data we have on how gender bias replicates in the academy. And I think we're up to 40. And we've annotated 40 different studies now in all fields across the academy. We distribute those around to provosts and deans. I think it's been distributed over 100,000 times now. The London School of Economics blog republishes it about every 6 months as well, and many other places. There's one I don't think I could say in public. It's SH something T, Academics Say, that has republished it several times, and that's gotten it out to the most people, more than the London School of Economics. So one hopes to have an impact, but there are many different places and much, 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 much room for improvement. Thank you for that question.
Hi, so I'm an undergrad here at Georgetown, and the anecdote that you told about the student at Harvard really rings true for me, where there are so many classes that Georgetown offers that I really want to take that I feel like I can't, because I want to just take them for the sake of learning. But with the way that schools and requirements work, that's not always possible. So my question is, what as a student can I do? Can I do anything?
Yes, there are many things, and I don't know enough about, these solutions are always local. There's everything from extracurricular, co-curricular things to, I know at the Red House they're experimenting with sort of micro courses. I'm sure I'm using the wrong terminology here, but small courses you can take. I don't know if there's a pass-fail option here. I do think that or a credit, no, I don't like the term pass-fail. I actually hate that term. Failure is another thing Charles Eliot invented. There was no F for failure. You did well or you didn't do well, but you didn't fail. What a horrible thing. A, B, C, D doesn't stand for anything. Why is F? Referential. It's horrible. And actually the reason F is referential is people were afraid if they put E's on people's grades, someone would think it meant excellent. So they came up with the F. Mount Holyoke is actually the first school that does this. But I do think credit, no credit classes, I really am a big advocate of that. That was a thing in the 80s and 90s. It's become less of a thing. I don't know if that's an option here. but it would be great if universities allowed a certain percentage of students, of course credits to be low stakes, low risk. House courses, I don't know if there's house courses offered here. Many universities will have dorm courses where dorms will ask a faculty member to come and just talk about subjects, or self-study groups. There are many things. Actually, in the back of the book, of my book, there's a thing on 10 things any professor can do to change their class, and then 10 tips for any student at the most boring university of how to get have an interesting life. Because not everybody you can't change the whole structure, but there's still things you can do to make your education as vital and important as you possibly can.
Hi, Cathy. Great to see you again. You've been
I can't see you though because of the light.
It's Derek Goldman.
Hi, Derek.
Nice to see you. And you've been an inspiration for many years since we were together in Carolina. And I just wanted to, it's related to something we wrote on our card, but it's an observation about something that seems like a positive development but has challenging implications, I think, which is I feel like we're encountering lots of really extraordinary invention away from disciplinary models on campus that are really substantive and really outward-looking and really partnership-based and doing quite radical things. But there are a lot of them proliferating in kind of sometimes horizontal ways without awareness of what each other are doing. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of pragmatic advice in an institution like this about how working, largely non-hierarchically, how folks partner to get kind of collective momentum around those shared values.
I totally agree. There's so many things happening everywhere, and often people don't know about the other things that are happening. And I don't know what I don't know the specific locales of communication here. I don't know if that's something the Red House tries to do, is make maps of different things that are happening around the university. The easiest thing is to throw up a website and see who will, see how you can find connections and how you can find connectors. Often, deans are very happy when you come forward and say, we're working on this project on X, and we'd love to know who else in the university in all the different fields are interested in X. Because deans are often looking for constructive ideas because they get a lot of unconstructive criticism a lot. I often find it's very, very effective, more effective than people give credit for. If 4 or 5 people write an email to somebody in power and say, here's a problem we've been having and we think this might be a good solution, and can you give us some help about how we might implement it? And often in a position like that, because you do see across the university and you have meetings of deans, meetings of chairs, they can make those connections happen. When I was in the central administration, I was shocked at how rarely faculty would actually come to me with a pitch and say, I would really love to try this. I got a lot of people who complained as if there was no change was ever possible. Or some people would have a one-off idea, but I loved it when groups of faculty would come and say, we've got this idea and we're not quite sure where to go from here. Can you help us with that? Because that's actually something administrators can do, right? So I would say a little bit of organizing and then a constructive two-part. Here's the problem and we've got some ideas of solution and we need your help. Often gets more attention than one thinks it would. But also the passivity of higher education, where you always assume that one person with power is going to tell you what to do, makes it hard to have that kind of voice. It's self-replicating. But I don't think I'm wrong here, that most people...
I don't think Georgetown faculty are waiting to be told what to do. I haven't discerned that yet. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We are honored by your presence, and this has been delightful. Thank you.
One question: would it be useful to collect those cards? Would it be useful to Red House at all? If you want to leave the cards behind, start activism today. But the pencils you get to keep.
Ah.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's really been great. Thank you.